This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit number 1. Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit number 1 was released in 2004 by Multiman Publishing and Avalon Hill, and designed by Ken Dunn. This game supports 2 players, and each scenario takes approximately 2 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. Welcome back to the Harsh Rules breakdown for Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit number 1. In this episode, we're going to cover the rout phase. A rout is a panicked, disorderly, and undisciplined retreat of troops. Routs are triggered by the collapse of a unit's willingness to fight due to the enemy's inevitable threat to their survival. In Advanced Squad Leader, there are situations where a unit may rout and more immediate threats where a unit must rout. There's a lot to unpack in this episode, so let's get started. First, let's talk about rout eligibility. What are the situations when a unit may rout versus when they must rout? Now, understanding this is critical to completing the rout phase, as you'll be checking for these conditions constantly. To be eligible to rout, a unit must be broken, under a desperation morale marker, and not engaged in melee. The only exception to this is an unpinned, unbroken leader stacked with a broken desperate unit may accompany them when they rout. Keep in mind, even without the immediate threat of an enemy unit in play, a broken and desperate unit's morale is on the edge of panicked flight. The unit is going to be looking for the nearest, safest hex. In the Advanced Squad Leader Starter Kit, these are hexes that contain either a building or woods. Therefore, in this state, the player may choose for the unit to give in to its fear and rout, or hold its position. The player loses this discretion with their rout-eligible unit when an immediate enemy threat applies pressure that pushes the unit's morale into a panicked retreat. This enemy pressure takes 2 forms. The first is when a broken, desperate unit is in or adjacent to a hex containing an enemy unit. The second form of pressure is when that unit is in open ground within normal range and line of sight of a known good order enemy unit eligible to interdict. Now that's quite a sentence, so let's break it down. Always remember that our unit is broken and desperate. They are in an open ground shooting situation, not just an open ground terrain type. When ASL treats open ground as a shooting situation, it means the shooter is within normal range and has clear line of sight to the target with no terrain hindrance in between. This rule basically mirrors the first fire movement in open ground rule, but remember, this FFMO modifier doesn't apply in a rout. So, think of it this way. When there is a potential shooter that has clear line of sight with no hindrance to a broken, desperate unit, then that unit must rout. So then, what does eligible to interdict mean? This is another military term, a version of interdiction. Interdiction is the act of delaying, disrupting, or destroying a force en route to a battle area. Basically, it means a unit that has the ability to stop another unit. However, ASL does not treat interdiction as its own fire attack. Instead, it is treated as an automatic morale check, and is made every time a routing unit enters a new hex and is subject to interdiction. We'll look at this in more detail in just a moment. Before we do though, let's look at some examples for rout eligibility. On the left-hand side of the screen, we have a broken German squad, and that squad is also tagged with a desperation morale marker. This means the unit is fully eligible to rout. However, with no enemy units on the map, the player may choose to rout to the stone building, or hold their position. let's add an enemy unit in the upper left-hand corner. Technically, this unit would have line of sight to the broken squad. However, they cannot interdict. Although the German unit is in an open ground hex, there is an orchard hex with hindrance in the shooter's line of sight. Therefore, the German squad is not in open ground. The German squad's player may choose for them to route to the stone building, but they don't have to. Let's add another enemy unit to the map. This one is adjacent to the broken, desperate German squad. Due to their proximity, the German squad must now route to the stone building. Finally, let's change the situation and add an enemy unit farther away but within normal range to the German squad. The enemy unit is in good order, has line of sight to the German squad with no hindrance in between. Therefore, the enemy unit is eligible to interdict, and the German unit must route to the stone building. Obviously, this example is super simple to make sure you get the concept for eligibility. Next, let's review how a normal morale check works with interdiction, and then we'll have everything we know to work our way through the route process. Next, let's talk about the interdiction morale check. The routing unit's player will make this dice roll for every hex space where interdiction applies. The exception to this is if the unit uses low crawl to route to an adjacent hex only, which negates interdiction. Now, the rulebook refers to this as a normal morale check, but this is misleading. With a normal morale check, a broken unit cannot be pinned. Apparently, though, the route phase is an exception to this rule. Therefore, I'm referring to this as an interdiction morale check because it includes pinning and is not the normal process. With a routing unit, players will check for interdiction each time it moves into a new hex. If the position makes interdiction eligible, then you make the morale check. Routing units become eligible as an interdiction target if they are not using low crawl, this is the route of one adjacent hex which negates interdiction, they are not in melee, and they must be in an open ground position to the firing unit, which means no hindrance in the line of sight path. An enemy unit is eligible to interdict if it's in normal range with line of sight to the target and no hindrance in the path, the unit is not in melee, broken, pinned, or exhausted. They can fire with at least one firepower, and the unit and/or support weapon are not suffering halved firepower, and it cannot be a lone leader with a machine gun support weapon. So, now that we understand eligibility for the routing unit and the enemy units attempting interdiction, let's look at the route process itself. So now that you know whether you can route or must route, how do you actually do it? So let's talk about the process. First, a unit will receive movement factors to attempt a route. Multi-man counters receive 6 movement factors. Single-man counters will also receive 6 unless wounded. In that case, they only have 3. A unit is also eligible to low crawl. Low crawl is similar to assault movement. The player spends all of its movement factors to move to an adjacent hex. The advantage of low crawl is it allows the unit to avoid interdiction. When routing, the unit must move to the nearest building or wood hex using its allotted movement factors, and may not route towards an enemy unit even if it is broken or its line of sight is blocked. It may only move closer if it started adjacent to an enemy unit, and this is the only path to route out. Once reaching the nearest woods or building hex, the routing unit must stop and end its route phase. Finally, let's cover some exceptions to this. A unit does not have to end its route phase if it still has movement factors to immediately enter a woods or building hex space. A unit may always route out of a building that it begins its route in, and it cannot enter a woods or hex space at its stacking limit. It also may ignore a woods or building hex that is no further from an enemy unit than its route starting position. And finally, if no building or wood hex can be reached during its route, it may route to any hex with the above restrictions. In our simple example, the enemies are all to the west. The nearest form of cover in a woods or building hex is the adjacent stone building. Therefore, the broken, desperate German squad can use low crawl to avoid interdiction and move into that hex. However, in more complex examples, enemies will be all around, enemies may be surrounding the routing unit, and the only eligible path to safety may not be the closest woods or building hex. It may be a woods or building hex much farther away, or even beyond reach. So let's take a look at some of these more complex situations. Next, let's discuss situations where a rout can fail. A routing unit may not end its movement in a position that requires a forced rout. This means they may not end their turn adjacent to an unbroken known enemy unit, and they may not remain in an open ground location in normal range and line of sight of a known good order enemy unit that would be able to interdict. However, there is an exception to this. If the unit routed by way of low crawl, this negates interdiction. Therefore, a unit could low crawl into an adjacent hex even if there is an enemy unit that could interdict, and in this way legally end its rout. Now, barring this exception, if a unit finds itself in a situation where it is forced the rout and has either exhausted all its movement factors or simply has no movement options available to it, then the unit is eliminated. Advanced Squad Leader's routing system are the most complex rules to learn in the game because they are so situational. You will need to check each unit's position and line of sight to the routing unit to figure out where you can even move. And once you move, you need to check everything all over again to make the next move. Therefore, it's helpful to plan out your options. First, establish the route direction. A unit must always route away from enemy units. Sometimes this can be difficult when surrounded, but if you can identify direction, it helps to narrow down the available paths. After that, identify the route destination. This is going to be the nearest in movement factors eligible woods or building hex. Some locations may not be eligible if adjacent to an enemy unit. Remember, you can't end your route adjacent to an enemy unit even if it is a woods or building hex. Finally, always check to see if you have a low crawl option. If you can low crawl into an adjacent hex, you can negate interdiction and end the rout phase for that unit. This still leaves your unit highly vulnerable in the next turn, but this may be safer than a long, dangerous route path to a building or woods hex that requires 2 or 3 interdiction morale checks that may end up eliminating your unit. Once again, it all depends on the situation. Once you've identified your route options, whether that's to make a full route or a low crawl into an adjacent hex, you can then make a decision based on the risk around each option. Remember, once you engage in a long route to a building or woods hex, rather than low crawl into an adjacent hex, you must use every movement factor to reach that destination. You cannot stop halfway through the route in a safe hex to avoid potential interdiction. Once you begin the long run for cover, you must follow through to the end. And now that we've covered the basics for the route phase, this is probably a good place to stop for this episode. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.